203 Hells Angels rode through Millbrook, Tennessee at 9 in the morning on a Saturday in September. And nobody in that town could explain it afterward. Not the gas station attendant who watched them pass from the window and counted 17 minutes from the first bike to the last. Not the woman who had been walking her dog on Sycamore and had stopped on the sidewalk and stood very still while they went by. The dog sitting beside her without being told. Not the deputy who had been notified by radio 12 minutes before they arrived and had driven to Main Street and parked and watched and made no move to stop them because they were in the right lane, keeping the speed limit to the mile, and there was no law against 200 motorcycles driving through a town in a line. No music, no horns. They did not wave. They did not look at the storefronts or the people on the sidewalks or the deputy in his cruiser. They looked forward, all of them, with the settled, forward-facing attention of people who know where they are going and are going there. They came down Main Street and turned left on Birch and rode 2 more blocks and stopped. They stopped in front of a small white house on the corner of Birch and Caldwell, and the engines died one by one down the length of the street. And the silence that followed was the kind of silence that a town only experiences once or twice in a generation. Total and final, and full of something that nobody in Millbrook had a word for yet. They were there for a woman named Edna Faye Hollister. Most of them had never met her. Every one of them knew what she had done. It had started 4 weeks earlier. Not with a message, not with a call, not with any of the things that usually start something like this. It had started with a single biker, alone on the interstate, and a woman standing on the shoulder of the road at 6 in the morning, with a flat tire and 31 years of quiet dignity and no one coming. The interstate through Millbrook ran east to west along the ridge above the town, and in the early morning it carried the trucks that had been running through the night, and the commuters heading toward Nashville, and on certain weekday mornings, a single Harley ridden by a man named Cross Tatum, who made the same route every Tuesday and Thursday from his place in Cookeville to a machine shop in Murfreesboro, where he did contract work and who had been making it for 6 years without incident. Cross was 48 years old, and he had been riding since he was 17, which meant that the road had become a thing he inhabited rather than traveled. A second kind of breathing, automatic and sustaining, requiring attention, but not thought. He was 6'1", and lean in the way of a man who had spent his working life moving things rather than lifting them. With a beard he kept short, and a vest that carried 31 years of Hells Angels membership on its back in the form of a bottom rocker that said Tennessee, and patches that said the rest. He was heading east in the left lane at 6:15 on a Tuesday in August when he saw the car on the shoulder. A white Buick LeSabre, 2004 or thereabouts, with the rear driver's side sitting visibly lower than the others. The hazard lights were on. A woman was standing beside the car with her hands at her sides, looking at the tire the way a person looks at a problem they have assessed and cannot solve. He moved to the right lane. He pulled over. He had been going to work, and now he was not going to work, and this was not a decision he made so much as a thing he did before the decision was complete. The way you hand a steadying arm to someone who has stumbled without first asking whether they want it. He put the kickstand down. He walked to the car. Before we get to what happened at that car on the shoulder, drop your city in the comments right now. Wherever you're watching from, I want to know. Someone is watching this from a town that looks a lot like Millbrook, Tennessee, and they need this story today. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Now back to Cross Tatum and the woman beside the white Buick. Because what she told him in the next 10 minutes was the kind of thing you don't forget on the road home. Her name was Edna Faye Hollister. She was 78 years old, and she had been driving herself everywhere she needed to go for 54 years, which she would tell you was not an achievement, but simply what you did when you lived where she lived and needed to get where she needed to get. She lived in the small white house on Birch and Caldwell in Millbrook, the same house she had moved into with her husband Raymond in 1971, when the paint was fresh and the maple in the front yard was the height of a child's shoulder. Raymond had died in 2008. The maple was 40 feet tall now. She still lived in the house, still drove herself to the pharmacy and the grocery and the church on Vine Street, where she had been a member for 52 years and where she served on the hospitality committee and kept the schedule for who brought flowers on which Sunday. She was a woman who kept track of things. She had a calendar on the kitchen wall, a paper calendar, the kind with the large squares on which she recorded every appointment, every obligation, every occasion she intended to mark. Birthdays in red ink, anniversaries in blue, medical appointments in pencil, because those sometimes moved. She had filled the same brand of calendar for 31 years and kept them in a box on the shelf in the back bedroom. And if you asked her what she had been doing on a given Tuesday in October 14 years ago, she could tell you, not because she had a remarkable memory, but because she had a remarkable system. She had a habit, also, of leaving a piece of pie on the back porch for her neighbor's cat, which technically was not her cat and technically was the neighbor's responsibility. But the neighbor worked long hours, and the cat had learned to expect the pie, and Edna Fay had decided, on the evidence, that the cat was not wrong to expect it. She was on her way to the pharmacy in Murfreesboro that morning. The pharmacy in Millbrook had been out of one of her blood pressure medications for 4 days, and she had not wanted to wait. When the tire went, she had pulled over correctly. She had turned on the hazards. She had assessed the situation with the same organized attention she brought to the calendar and the pie and the hospitality committee. She was on an interstate, alone, at 6 in the morning, at 78 years old, with a flat tire and a spare she was not going to be able to change herself, and a phone whose battery was at 11%. She had called her daughter in Cookville. No answer. She had called a neighbor. No answer. She had stood beside the Buick for 14 minutes, watching the trucks and the commuters go past at 70 miles an hour, and she had not flagged anyone down, because flagging people down on an interstate at 6 in the morning was not safe, and Edna Fay Hollister had not survived 78 years by doing things that were not safe. She had been standing there, hands at her sides, waiting in the particular way she had, patient, calibrated, without visible distress, when the Harley had pulled over. She had not expected it. She had not expected a man in a Hells Angels vest to crouch down beside her tire and change it in 12 minutes, with the competent efficiency of someone who had done this on the side of roads for 30 years, and who, when she thanked him, said only, "You got somewhere to be?" And when she said the pharmacy in Murfreesboro said, "I'll follow you in case the spare gives," she had told him that was not necessary. He had followed her anyway. He had waited in the pharmacy parking lot for 22 minutes while she was inside. He had confirmed, when she came out, that the spare looked all right and that she should get a new tire before the week was out. He had said, "Drive safe, ma'am." He had ridden away. She had watched him go. She had driven home. That evening, she had done something she almost never did, which was tell someone about her day without being asked. She had called her daughter, who had called back, apologizing for the missed call, and she had said, "A biker stopped for me on the interstate this morning, changed my tire, and followed me to the pharmacy. His name was Cross." She had paused. "I want you to know that when people tell you to be afraid of certain kinds of people, sometimes they are wrong." Her daughter had been quiet for a moment. "That's a good story, Mama," she said. It was. But it was not yet the whole story. Cross Tatum had not thought much about the encounter on the interstate. He had changed tires before. he would change tires again. He had followed her to the pharmacy because the spare was older than he was comfortable with, and because the alternative, leaving a 78-year-old woman on the interstate with an uncertain spare, was not something he was going to do. He had thought about it once more on the way back, when the tire had held and she had driven steadily and correctly, and had thanked him with the specific, direct courtesy of a woman who meant what she said, and said no more than she meant. He had thought, she's been taking care of herself for a long time. That was all. He had mentioned it at the Tuesday night chapter meeting in Cookville, in the way you mention things that happened during the week when the meeting opens the floor, not as a story, not as anything requiring attention, just as a fact. Stopped for a woman on the interstate. Flat tire. 78 years old, on her own. She was fine. He had moved on. But a man named Dawes Pryor, who was 62 years old, and who had been riding with the chapter for 27 years, and who had, 3 years ago, driven 400 miles to change his own mother's tire when she had been stuck on a highway in Alabama, and no one had stopped for an hour, had not moved on. Dawes had sat with it. He had sat with the image of a 78-year-old woman on an interstate at 6 in the morning, with her hands at her sides and the hazard lights going and the trucks passing at 70 miles an hour. And he had thought about his mother in Alabama, and he had thought about the specific quality of that kind of waiting, the patient, dignified, invisible waiting of a woman who has been taking care of herself for 50 years and who is not going to wave her arms or make a scene, but who is, underneath the composure, alone in a way that should not be allowed. He had found Cross after the meeting. "You know where she lives?" Cross had looked at him. "Millbrook," he said. "Little white house," she said. "Birch Street." Dawes had nodded. He had not said anything else. Cross had watched him walk to his bike and had understood, in the way that men who have been riding together for a long time understand things without them being said, that something had been decided. Dawes Pryor made 7 calls in the following 2 weeks, not to organize, not to recruit, to tell the same story 7 times to 7 different men, each of whom told it to others, each of whom understood without being told what the story was asking. The story was not asking for anything, actually. It was just a story. A woman alone on an interstate, a flat tire, a man who stopped, a spare that held. A woman who told her daughter to remember that people are not always what you are told to fear. That was all. And yet the calls kept going, chapter to chapter, state to state, in the way that certain stories travel when they find the right current. Not because anyone had organized a response, or called for action, or sent a message. Because the story had landed in the right place, and enough of the right people, and certain things follow certain stories the way a river follows a grade, not because it is directed, but because it has no choice. The ride was not announced. There was no flyer, no group message, no date posted anywhere. There was only the morning of September the 14th, a Saturday, when 203 motorcycles assembled in the pre-dawn dark at a rest stop on the interstate outside Cookville, Tennessee, without anyone having told them to be there by a specific hour, and when the last one arrived at 8:47, they had simply begun to move. 2 lanes. Measured, the speed limit to the mile. No music. No horns. Edna Faye Hollister was in her kitchen at 9:14 when she heard the sound. She was making her Saturday breakfast, 2 eggs, 1 slice of toast, the coffee that had been brewing since 7, and she heard it come up from the direction of Main Street before she had a name for it. A low, rolling sound that filled the street from curb to curb and vibrated the cabinet doors on their hinges. The kind of sound that is not loud so much as it is total. She set down the spatula, She went to the front window. The first bike was already on Birch Street. She stood at the window with her hand on the curtain and watched them come. They came around the corner from Main in a line two abreast, and they kept coming, and they kept coming, and the street filled with the sound and the chrome and the leather until there was nothing visible on Birch Street in either direction except motorcycles moving at the pace of a slow walk. And then they stopped, and the engines died one by one in a sequence that moved down the line like something spreading. And then the street was silent. 200 motorcycles in the morning light. Not one of them looked at her window. They were facing forward, all of them, the way they had ridden. Still, quiet, present in the particular way of people who have made a decision about where to be and are simply being there. Edna Fay stood at the window for a long moment. Then she went to the door. She opened it. She stepped onto the porch where she had left pie for the neighbor's cat every evening for 3 years. The porch where Raymond had put up the swing in 1974 and where it still hung, weathered and sturdy. And she looked at the street. The street looked back. A man near the front of the line stepped off his bike. He was 62 years old, and he had a gray beard and a road-worn vest, and he walked to the edge of the yard and stopped. He did not come up the porch steps. He did not need to. "We heard about the interstate," he said. Edna Fay looked at him. She looked at the street. She looked back at him. "I don't understand," she said. "You told your daughter," he said, "that when people tell you to be afraid of certain kinds of people, sometimes they are wrong." He paused. We wanted to say the same thing back. Edna Fay Hollister stood on her porch in her kitchen clothes with her hand on the doorframe and looked at 200 men in Hell's Angels vests standing in the street in front of her house in the September morning light. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The maple tree in the front yard, 40 feet tall and full with the last of the summer, moved slightly in the early wind, and its shadow crossed the yard and reached the edge of the street. And the street held the shadow in the silence, and the 200 men who had come to answer a woman who had not asked a question. Something broke in Edna Fay's face then. Not composure, not strength, but the specific thing that breaks when a person who has been alone for a long time understands that they are not. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. Her chin went up. Her eyes went bright. She did not cry. She was Edna Fay Hollister, and she did not cry on porches. But her voice, when she spoke, was different from the voice of a moment before. "Would anyone like coffee?" she said. They did not all come in. 200 men cannot fit in a small white house on Birch Street in Millbrook, Tennessee, and Edna Fay would not have wanted them to, because the house was her house and she kept it a particular way. But 12 of them came in. The ones nearest the front. The ones who seemed by some unspoken arrangement to have been selected as the right number. And she made coffee twice, and they stood in her kitchen and her living room, and looked at the calendar on the wall, and the box of 31 years of calendars on the shelf in the back bedroom doorway that she showed them, because someone had asked, and the maple tree through the window. Cross came in with the second group. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and she saw him and recognized him from the interstate. "You," she said. "Me," he said. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Raymond would have liked you," she said. "He always said you can tell a man by whether he stops." Cross was quiet. "Whether he stops?" he asked. "On the road," she said, "when someone needs help, whether he keeps going or whether he stops." She looked at the kitchen window, the light coming through it the same way it had for 50 years. Raymond always stopped. Cross nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They had coffee. The men in the street waited with the patience of people who had nowhere better to be. Some talked among themselves in the way that people who know each other talk when there is nothing urgent to say. Some sat on their bikes. Some stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the maple tree. The deputy, who had followed them from Main Street and had parked his cruiser at the end of the block, got out and leaned against the hood and watched, and said nothing, and did not move to leave. At 10:47, the 12 men came back out of the house. Dawes Pryor came last. He stood on the porch step and turned back to Edna Fay in the doorway. He had been thinking about what to say. He had not found it. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "Thank you for the company," she said. He went down the steps. He went to his bike. The engine started. They started in sequence down the length of Birch Street. 1, then 3, then 20. Then the whole block, a single rolling wave of sound that built and steadied and held for a moment, the way a held breath holds before it releases. And then the line began to move. They turned right on Caldwell. They went north to Main. They passed the gas station attendant who had counted them coming in and now counted them going out. The same slow 17 minutes, the same 2 abreast, the same forward-facing attention. No music, no horns, no explanation. Edna Fay stood on her porch and watched until the last one turned off Main and the sound faded down the ridge toward the interstate. Then the street was quiet. The deputy drove past on his way back to the station. He raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel, in the way of a man nodding to something he cannot name, but recognizes as right. Edna Fay raised her hand. She went inside. She went to the kitchen calendar and found the square for September 14th, and picked up her red pen and wrote 2 words in it, the way she recorded every occasion worth marking. They came. She put the pen down. She went to finish her breakfast, which had gone cold but which she ate anyway, at the kitchen table by the window, in the house that was hers, in the town that had watched something it did not fully understand and had recognized it anyway. Why did 200 Hells Angels ride silently through Millbrook, Tennessee, with no music, no horns, and no explanation? Because a woman told her daughter to remember that people are not always what you are told to fear. Because certain men heard that and decided to say the same thing back. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone who has been invisible is to show up in a way that cannot be ignored. And because Raymond Hollister had always stopped on the road when someone needed help. And some debts don't expire. They just wait for the right people to pay them. If this story reached you, if you believe that showing up is its own kind of language, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment. Have you ever been seen by someone you didn't expect? Type stopped in the comments if this one stayed with you.